Welcome back to Agati Video Podcast. This is a space where we host conversations with architects, designers, and different industry thought leaders to help educate you in your work. My name is Joe Agati, and I'm the CEO and Director of Design here at Agati Furniture. Today on our podcast, we've got Jeff Hoover, Principal and the Library Design Director of Tappé Architecture. Jeff and I have worked together on a few projects in the past and hosted webinars together. Welcome to the podcast today, Jeff. How you doing?
I'm doing great. It's good to be with you once again.
Good. It's great to have you here. So typically we like to start off, and I'd love to get just some background on you, basically your life's journey that's led you here today.
Well, I've been doing library planning and design at Tappé Architects since about 1984. So it's been a few decades of focus on that, and pretty much all of that time, it's been nothing but public and academic and private libraries. I did have dabbled a couple other project types. There's been a school or two that really were other folks in the firm's areas of expertise, but they've got media centers and learning centers and libraries, and so there is some involvement in that. But other than that, and one or two residences, I guess. It really has been a comprehensive focus on just doing libraries. So that has been an interesting time because in the 80s, libraries were, completely different, had different concerns about what the future would hold for them than they do now, certainly. So I have been witness to and part of a couple of great sort of sea changes in library design, but also library responses to service initiatives as they've up and disappeared also over the course of decades. So I've got a great sort of perch here overlooking library land.
Yeah. So how did you first get started in libraries or interested in library work?
Well, if I went back to doing thesis work or work in college, I consciously avoided library projects as they came up. I don't know why, but I was not a fundamental library lover type person in terms of my growing up. A lot of people will tell stories about their great love for libraries when they were toddlers or whatever. It began that way for me. Essentially, I came to Boston in 1984 looking for work, and Tappé Architects were one of the firms I interviewed with. And Tony Tappé, founding principal, was married to a woman who was a school librarian and involved in publishing children's books. He had that bias, and shortly before I started, the state of Massachusetts had determined they'd like to assess the condition of all of the libraries in the state, and they needed to have an architect. Tony got that job. He visited every single library and assessed their physical condition, but also their capacity to meet what was imagined to be community needs at that time. And as a result of that background, he knew every librarian in the state. And when projects came up, he was the go-to guy. And as a result, began to really build the practice at that point on doing public libraries. And I stepped in at probably, I think the firm started in 74. So 5 years into his own private, practice on it, after being with the Architects Collaborative, who you may remember for the great modernist work there in Cambridge. After his work there and his work with another partner from there afterwards, he started his own practice, and it really became all about libraries. And so I started on a historic one at first, the Beverly Library, Cass Gilbert design. He did the Detroit Public Library and a couple others I can't remember anymore, but some great, Carnegie-esque and some Carnegie as well, neoclassical compositions, very refined design in that vein. But anyhow, that was one of my first projects, was to take something that was, 15,000 square feet and make it be, I think, 50,000 square feet. So it was a great opportunity for a young designer to step in and be just sort of handed this thing to figure out. And so that was the start. And what I realized that makes it interesting to an architect is, sort of the quality of the materials palette you get to work with doing libraries, because you're thinking about, of course, durability and maintainability, but that leads you to, terrazzo is pretty good, and other materials that have great, wear factors are also pretty high end in terms of creating, a high quality of finish. And the space, it wasn't hard to argue for infusing a space with daylight. Because it makes for, even then, I think everybody recognized before the studies were done in the late 80s and early 90s that really demonstrate a person's capacity to retain knowledge or learn new things in a daylit environment is measurably better than in an equivalent artificially lit environment. Even then, people could understand that, and configuring a floor plan to be rife with daylight, meant maybe there's floor openings, maybe there's skylights, and there's a spatial dynamic that came, I think, out of that. So that's exciting, right? All of the great ones, and even me, really like to sculpt space. I mean, it's not a two-dimensional exercise. We're constantly thinking about the third and fourth dimension as well, thinking about how a person experiences a building over time or a time of day as part of the overall environmental experience. So recognizing that, oh my God, it's a great palette of materials. People expect the spaces to be a little bit elevating emotionally as people come in. And you've recently talked to Bill Browning, and his, the 14 biophilic principles now have the 15th one, which is awe. Yeah. Having a sense of awe and recognizing what that does in the chemistry in your brain and your capacity to absorb new information is really interesting. I'm sure Bill knows more about that. But that is part of what we've always been seeking to create in the library design we've done, without fully recognizing, the clinical assessment of the ability to improve a learning or awareness of environment. That has always been part of it. That's so exciting, right? It was hard to work on anything else after, recognizing the potential for sort of personal opportunity to realize our goals as designers. But then, combining that with what the design offers to the community afterwards, what done well, what the degree to which a community benefits from your hedonistic pleasure of creating great space is really wonderful. From a number of different perspectives, how important a library, a successful, welcoming, inclusive library can do for a community, and sort of conversely, if done wrong or poorly, what it could also do for a community. If people aren't encouraged to just sort of be in a space that provides them with a host of interesting opportunities. Done right, it makes a big difference, and it's good fun to do at the same time. And of course, the other thing is that librarians are such great people. Yeah. I mean, they're cut, from a certain cloth, I guess, that makes them be, generally speaking, if I hate to make gross generalizations, but they're curious people. And I guess you can read that both ways. Boy, what a curious person. But they want to know stuff, and yes, they have avenues to find it out.
Yes. Yeah. It's very rare that I would say that I would find a librarian that's not extremely passionate about what they do for the community, what they do for their patrons. So it's a very kind of, I've always found, yes, it's a very invigorating group of people to kind of work with, because it's always exciting to work with people that are passionate about what they do, and it kind of invigorates, the people around them.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's, sort of my trajectory that has led me into doing libraries. And I think I've been involved in 100 or probably more, I guess, because there's always, at a low point, I guess, 3 active library projects in the office at any one time. And at the other end, maybe 8, maybe 10 could be in various stages of design, and construction at any one time. So 35 years of doing that, 3 to 10 at a time, it adds up.
It definitely.
A lot of At this point, more projects than I can fully remember, I guess. So, on at least one significant occasion, we've just gone back and renovated and expanded a project that we did earlier, because times have changed. The Keene Public Library comes to mind, where there's, Agati product there too, by the way, you may remember. But there's, different service model, different goals have emerged. And I think the ones that emerged starting about the middle of the first decade of the 20th century and sort of progressing until now, and will continue sort of with only modest influence from the pandemic into at least the next 5 years. I see, a certain trajectory libraries are on relative to creating good people space, and dovetails in with the general topic of, sort of designing for human behavior, which is a different animal,
Yeah. So you've mentioned a few times now that you've seen kind of libraries, kind of service plans and kind of change over the decades that you've been kind of working in the space. Can you kind of give me an example of that or pick that apart a little bit? Like where, maybe give us a little bit of history of where they started from the 80s, how they've evolved now, and maybe where you think they're going in the future?
Back in the 80s, we were really thinking about growth, and it wasn't growth of population, it was growth of collections. And many of the libraries we were starting to work on they needed us because the books had pushed the people out of the building. Collection growth had sort of gone unchecked. To build local collections that had every possible element that would be, interesting to the whole broad spectrum of the community was a big, was a fundamental goal. And collections and started crowding folks. And so they needed more space. But so you can see what the emphasis is. And even, the long-term goals, the future planning part of this project was make sure there's a space on the site of your library for another expansion. You're going to expand, or you're going to put a new library down. And frankly, to get funded in Massachusetts from the state, you had to demonstrate that in 20 years you could expand again. And that expansion was really calculated based on collection growth. And we just don't see libraries planning that way anymore. Collection tuning, collection management, collection strategies seem to be about determining the right collection size for the reader population in the service population size. So if the population size is stable, then the collection size is stable, and we just new books are published and old ones become less interesting. So there's the perpetual weeding that goes on. That changed. The second change I think that happened that begins to tilt us towards designing for human behavior is the notion that libraries are active places. And I think that in the 90s, no one would know what you were talking about if you said, I want my library to have an information commons or be an information commons, because the terminology did. Maybe the experience was only sort of beginning to emerge, that it was the place on campus that really supported interdisciplinary conversations, which is fundamental, to an overall learning environment. Going back, to Alexandria, the great library there, which had all those scrolls and materials, but it also had the fundamental thing, which was for people to get together, the porticos. The porticos were the place scholars would discuss things. I think that model sort of still became emphasized in academia, and recognizing the place of the library the role of the library to support people having conversations about ideas. That became super important. To the extent, of course, that academic libraries were clearing out floors. We worked on the planning for the James Branch Cabell Library at Virginia Commonwealth University. But before they even started in on the design process, they cleared out a floor of books, and they turned it into a test case for creating a big collaborative area, like 30,000 square feet of conversation, which a test with a certain result that suggests we won't repeat that idea because it was so sort of successful, but also so loud and so cacophonic that it didn't really, work in terms of broader goals. It demonstrated the degree to which students were seeking this sort of ability to have space and colleagues, but it also pointed out certain needs. Like people will behave in a certain way in that environment, and that doesn't necessarily work with the people right next to them.
Yes.
And how do we begin to shape environments that allow people to have or encourage people to behave certain ways in certain places? We're recognizing a spectrum of ways to interact with information. We need environments that suggest behavior. And that became the big difference. I like to say, we were designing for books before, and that had certain challenges. Pretty easy though, frankly. And now we're designing for people and designing to support and encourage human behavior. My favorite thing to say, frankly, is, and it's not rocket science, but it's way harder than that. Rocket science, hard physics, and this is behavioral science, and that's something completely different. But it really, it points to the need to craft special environments that support particular activities, and allow people to have an elevating experience in the library. So the whole notion of repository libraries is, of course, I think long gone from most librarians' perceptions of library. And the repository is in support of activity, to the extent that it needs to be, in proximity. And that begins to sort of, shape the, another factor that shapes the configuration of a space is having a great discussion, but the great discussion needs access to resources. And what are those resources? And sometimes it's technical, sometimes it's human, and other times it's informational that is tangible. Then you take that as at academia, we're only looking at this little swath of the demographic, certainly in terms of age. Some small variations in there because grad students are a completely different animal than freshmen. But then think about that at birth and going through senior citizens, and this little swath of design challenge is now this big, right? The bandwidth has gotten a lot bigger and there are a lot more variables. And generally speaking, you have to do all that in a lot less space. Yes. In the public library. So that's pretty interesting. And I think that is the focus, is creating space that makes a broad section of a community comfortable in so many ways in the library. And you, of course, know all about the sort of the physical comfort factor of a person spending time in a chair and in other environments. But and you also, I know that from your focus, you also know that it takes a lot more to create overall comfort than just sort of the pad on the chair. How comfortable is that? There's the whole shaping of that that space, and the furniture helps shapes the space to make a person feel secure, person feel welcome, make the person feel like they have private space, make a person feel like I feel conversational here, or I don't feel conversational there. I feel studious. What environments can help you make that shift in what you think you can accomplish.
Yeah, and it's interesting when I was listening to you talk about how like the transformation of the libraries, like from the 80s going to being, book driven to then, being kind of also book and expansion in the 90s, then moving towards experimenting with like open group collaboration and kind of now where we're at now. I find it fascinating that, libraries being such that they are kind of like beacons and reflections of the community, reflections of society, how it very much marries up to like how we kind of like, if I think back to like kind of through that period of time, how we kind of viewed society is in that, 80s and 90s, it was very much like, I feel like a lot of people took a very general approach to like human behavior and to society. And then I think, as you know, especially in the more recent kind of like decade, it seems like we've come to understand and probably be more accepting of the fact that, you know, there's a lot more uniqueness out in the community than we've probably, you know, had really given credence to before. Where now it's, you know, you can't just generalize everything, that it's, you know, there's more individuality, you know, between groups of people, that we kind of, you know, if the library is going to be a reflection of that, we need to accommodate that. Because I've seen that in our own kind of requests of, you know, of different types of furniture, and, you know, looking at kind of how the spaces evolve, especially like you're talking about. The public library is really challenged because it's a finite amount of space, but it has to meet almost an infinite amount of kind of different types of people. And so it makes it a really kind of unique challenge in that environment.
Yeah. And I think that a variety of, well, the broad cross section of the community in the library, you know, is part of that challenge that you just identified, but also, and crafting an environment that makes each different component feel comfortable, welcome, and productive, or, you know, inspired or something. The challenge is compounded because you have to accommodate people who ordinarily wouldn't cross paths or prefer to spend time together in the same space.
Yeah.
I mean, fundamentally, what we want to avoid doing is creating or elevating conflict between people. We want things. We want to avoid creating unpleasant experiences, and that can happen when you push people together. I mean, the classic thing for public libraries is, you know, creating the distance between kids and seniors, because the seniors don't like how noisy those kids are, but the kids don't really actually appreciate how loud the seniors have to talk to one another to be heard. So, I mean, it goes both ways a little bit.
Yeah.
Those who are for the most quiet are sometimes really loud. But that's an aside. It's just a representation of sort of like accommodating everybody at the same time is the other challenge. Oftentimes in limited space, because I don't know when we felt like we were designing a library that had all the space we really wanted, you know, to accomplish all of the goals that it has. We're all, you know, up against the budget every single time. So even people who don't use the library, and you know, John Schrotzka of every library would tell you this. Even people who don't use the library find value in it, and it's like the demographic we're thinking of is a wealthier tier of society doesn't need a library because they get all those resources they need at home, and they have other, you know, venues for social interactions, you know, sometimes private or exclusive in some ways, but they understand that the community benefits from library, and that is sort of the top tier for fundraising and capital campaigns that have a private component to that. Yeah. Other than libraries that are just completely, you know, state or municipal funded, infusing it with cash from those kinds of benefactors, I guess. Going back to the concept of patron, we talk about library patrons. It's probably a complete misnomer, right? When the patrons of like the early 1900s were the people who bought the library for the community. You know, the E.C. Scranton Library in Madison, Connecticut is named that because E.C. Scranton bought the library for the community. That's a patron, right? The people who use the library are the library customers, and a lot of, you know, library directors like to think of the population they serve in the library as their customers, not patrons. But there are still patrons out there, and, you know, in the right way, they want to do the right thing. Yeah. I think we were talking earlier about the new library in Cecil County that just opened. What day is today? A week ago today was the dedication ceremony, and to realize all of the goals, they had to, you know, ask the well-to-do component of the community to pony up, and they were excited to do so. And as a result, you know, we were able to create this early learning environment in kids that they couldn't really afford. I mean, that would be a nice to have, so important. There's no way our budget affords enough space to realize that. So, you know, don't count on it until they put together a capital campaign. They said, well, why don't you model that idea for us in ways that we can really explain what it could do for the community. And with that kind of resource and a little bit of time and hard work from their capital campaign, they raised more than twice as much money as it costs to realize that component of the project. So, and that that came up with our Libby Mill Library as well, of course, which was popped down in the center of Nowheresville at the time, because it was a cleared parcel of, I don't know, what was it, 40 acres or something like that. That was part of a new development, new multi-use development. The first project to go in was the library. And that got a lot of support eventually from the developer, because they just saw what an economic draw a library is. Originally, allocated to some corner of the site. To say was 1,000 visitors a day to them. And it's like 1,000 visitors a day. I mean, that goes in the center. That's our anchor. Yeah. And then it was a project put there and really became sort of the identifier of that development. It's like, oh, it's the development with the library in the middle of it. Pretty cool. And and then the other parts of it have grown up around it, since that was realized. And the metric that property values are higher closer to a library. I mean, there's those kinds of things that suggest real dollar value to libraries in a community. Then, of course, the harder part to measure is the contribution it makes to people's lives. That's hard to have hard numbers for. So we usually talk about that in terms of generalities. The capacity of a library to become a term that actually the director of Cecil, Morgan Miller, coined, was the library, yes, center of community, but not a community center, of course, because that's recreational and we're more cultural, but really the center of opportunity, the place that people can go to realize, whatever it is that they're pursuing. It's a place where that particular library has, a business information library, and to help, people with their nation, business enterprises. They want to, do a startup, or they have, experience and they want help, taking their business to the next level. Having that opportunity center for them, the early education center, as the opportunity for parents who new parents haven't got a clue what to do with this new little person. The library is an opportunity for them to, especially if they're not in a position where they can afford help, and relatives are too far away. They don't have a history of great upbringing in their, family background. The library is a center of opportunity for them. And teens, we're always getting this notion that the library should be the place in the community where teens prefer to go after school. So it's a kind of hangout, as well as being a place to complete homework, and interface with culture at another level that they might not be able to experience otherwise. So that capacity of the library to be the resource center that elevates a person and thereby elevates a community. It is, one of the fundamental tools of lifting up a community, and especially a new library or a recently renovated one. We see just so much excitement about going there and being there and spending time in that kind of environment. So.
Yeah, since we've been kind of talking here, there, a lot of what you've kind of talked about is like the impact on the library has on the community. And on your guys' site, you have this statement, our commitment is to improve communities, not just build buildings. That obviously that ties into a lot of what we were just talking about too. I wonder if you can kind of expand upon that a little bit more, maybe give me like one or two like specific examples of like what that means and what that looks like.
Sure. I mean, we specialize in buildings that enhance communities. I mean, we don't do retail. We don't do residential. We're really doing, pretty much schools and libraries at various different kinds of levels. Some academic libraries, some higher ed, mostly public libraries and K through 12 education. So those are our community enhancing buildings by definition. And then, part of the architectural challenge is, to create a building which is a reflection reflection of the community, but not a reflection of the community as it is, a reflection of the community as it imagines itself, going. It's a reflection of aspiration.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. And we need to know something about community to make that happen, right? Because we're not from there by default. We're from somewhere else, and we're coming to a community. And so there's a process of us getting to understand what the community, aspires to. You can't just ask that question, what do you aspire to, and how would that represent itself in architecture? Mm-hmm. To a person, so it's a bit of a research and dialogue that progresses to a place where we feel comfortable making a design response. I think that as an example, the building we recently completed in Henrico County with Quinn Evans Architects is a Fairfield library, Fairfield area for Henrico County, and that we'd done 3 libraries for Henrico County already, and this is in the most economically depressed component of the county. The community, told us, we may be poor, but we're proud, and we want a facility that reflects the pride we have in our place, and the pride we have in our persons, and the pride we have in our families. And it became an interesting component of crafting the appropriate architectural response that really fit in that community and wasn't going to fit over there in the adjacent part of the county. Different community, different perspectives on life, so what emerged from that project? Well, that's the project where we first crafted what we call a family gathering space. I think in a library, because we always have there's the teens and the children's and the adults and the seniors. They've got their corner by the fireplace and. This said, well, that's great, but usually we have like households with 4 generations, and coming to the library as a household, maybe there should be places where grandma or great grandma is comfortable with a teen sitting together and working on something. And that's not in the teen room, right? You're not bringing your grandma in here into the teen center. It just wouldn't work. We want craft space that makes grandma feel comfortable there, because we want teens to feel comfortable with teens. And you can't do it in adults. Grandma's an adult, but that conversation with the teen maybe isn't exactly supported in the adult area, because the teen's sitting right in this chair, and it's like, that's not the right posture or something. So we really created a separate zone, and sort of naturally it fell between sort of geographically within the library between children's and teens. There's the family gathering space in between, which really supports this notion of a multi-generational environment in a library, and that came out of the dialogue with community. Wanted to support community in that way. And having done that, I thought every library needs this. Every library needs a family gathering space, but it isn't true. We just completed the Weymouth Library shortly after completing the Fairfield one. And we talked about this notion of creating a family place, and the community felt they didn't really need it. They have enough other places in the community environment that for family activities, and there was a lot, going on with, youth centers and other things, and a general focus on activities that were outdoors anyway, that the family gathering space in that library is the park in which the building sits, year round. And it's cold outside, but there's a sledding hill, and we're out there as a family, and we can come into the library. And so it's not right for every community, but it is something that came out of a community process. And it's something that really supports, community connectivity and individual prosperity. We've all been told and probably studied and learned this, that the fundamental attribute that a person has for likely success in life is the strength of the family from which they come, right? Mm-hmm. And if you can build libraries that support stronger families, you've done something amazing. You've created new opportunity for the offspring from those families to achieve new levels of success, and elevate families through generations with the building. And if you've done something like that, it feels pretty good.
Yeah,
I mean,
absolutely.
it's sort of from the perspective of a person making, as I said earlier, sort of having the hedonistic interest in crafting great space, having that great space produce those kinds of results is, way more rewarding than just like looking at sculpted space,
Yeah,
So that's I think, examples of getting excited, I guess,
absolutely.
about doing buildings that support community. And, everybody who works for us or with us is dialed into that concept.
Yeah.
The librarians that we work with, obviously, to the staff that we work with, our consultants, our partners in architecture. We, with all of that library experience, sort of in one geographic location in Boston, we've enjoyed having opportunities to share that, by working in other geographic locations where we have no connections except for through other like-minded architects. And so we've enjoyed doing that with our partner architects and elevating communities in many places. I mean, helping being part of a process that elevates communities in places, because it's such a collaboration of efforts, from librarians to the community served, to our design partners, to construction partners, everybody, to our, even like the guys who do furnishings for our projects, even those guys, like maybe Joe Agati, are dialed into this notion of how are we going to create environments that are really good for people and increase their capacity to learn, or just increase their overall personal well-being. And I think that notion of well-being is an interesting one, because when I say that, it means not only my sense of wellness and my sense of happiness, but also an avenue to create not only sort of a better health, but also, more prosperity, better wealth at the same time. I think the library contributes again to that. The library experience contributes to enhancing health and wealth in individuals and communities. So it's hard to want to do another kind of project, frankly.
Yeah, absolutely. With the pandemic happening right now, where do you see kind of the library, and I guess, since we've been talking about community, where the library is going, the impact on the community? How do you see this kind of like, the next 1 to 2 to 5 years kind of evolves, and how the pandemic is going to have an effect on that?
Well, I think that the isolation of the pandemic has been the issue, for libraries and librarians, trying to separate people in a place where we really want people to come together, as well as have the isolated experience, of a place for focused concentration to get, something visually. But I think that the challenge going forward is shaping libraries for inclusiveness and equity, because the free to all is great, but I think in making it enticing to all, welcoming to all, inclusive for all, and creating new opportunities for everybody in your community, is a challenge going forward. And some of that has to do, back to the 80s and earlier with collections, but a lot of it has to do with the other spaces for new opportunities in the library. I think those are the fundamental, challenges for the next, at least the next 5 years. They're thinking around those lines, and part of that comes down to enticing people who wouldn't ordinarily be interested in coming to the library, enticing them to with interesting opportunities for them to improve their lives. So, there's always the awareness campaign that libraries have to do to tell people how cool they are, who may not know. And that challenge, of course, remains. But certainly, there's nothing like opening a renovated or new facility to build excitement about going to see. And once you entice people in, making sure you have something that entices them back as part of that space, is important. And relative to the pandemic, I think we all think that imminently better times are around the corner. There's a new moment happening or about to happen, and that'll be pretty positive. I think we're on the cusp of some really great new times, and in libraries and in general.
Yeah. So Jeff, I really appreciate the time today. I guess the one last thing I'd like to get your kind of advice or perspective on, is there any kind of words of wisdom or encouragement that you'd like to kind of give out to architects, library directors out there, as we kind of look forward?
Part of the fundamental challenge in the next few years, coming back to that, is to make libraries be uniquely responsive to their local community. There isn't a sort of one size fits all type of question. There's no international design style sort of philosophy about libraries that works. I think in order for libraries to continue to be super relevant within their communities, they need to resonate uniquely with the population there. And that becomes kind of a programming level of challenge, to draw out from communities. What can the library do for you? Which is a different question than what can you do in the library, which is the important part of that. But really learning what creates what will create a library for them that becomes this new center of opportunity, and then of course realizing it. And then, of course, the added challenge, as we all know, is that will change over time, and the building can only change so much. So back to the pre-80s mantra, the three most important things in library design are flexibility, flexibility, and flexibility, just like real estate, location, location, location.
That's right. Flexibility is key. It's key. Well, Jeff, I really appreciate the time today. It was really great to kind of get your perspective and really great to hear your passion about libraries and the impact on the community and kind of what that can do.